November 1942. The Volga ran black and wide. The city of Stalingrad had already become a rumor of fire and rubble when Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann arrived with his platoon. He was 22, slight, with hands made callous by dough and wheel, not by soldiering. In the photographs he carried folded in his wallet, he looked like the same young man who'd rolled pastry in his father's bakery in Würzburg. A smudge of flour across his cheek, a crooked grin when the camera clicked. The Wehrmacht had taken him from ovens to mud, with the same steady indifference with which it took so many others. His first letter home was formal on the surface. Käthe, I arrived by train. We are well. But the edges of the note bore the detail ordinary people recognize. He described a fellow in his squad who kept a thin strip of black bread wrapped in oilcloth because he liked the way the air smelled when he unwrapped it. He described the way snow tasted like metal when it froze in your beard. He sent no complaints about the command. That was not his voice at first. Instead, he wrote small things. The name of the field bakery where he'd traded a watch for a loaf so men with wounds could have something warm. The name of a song a captive Russian humored them with in broken German. Letters were not luxuries in Stalingrad so much as lifelines. For families at home, the envelope was a brief, stubborn proof that someone still existed. For soldiers, writing was a thin ritual that tethered them to a world that still had kitchens and children and winter coal. Karl wrote in his small, neat hand because he believed, as many men did, that neatness was a kind of order you could carry inside you regardless of the chaos around. He wrote to Käthe not only what he saw but what he feared she needed, reassurance that he was still himself. By December, the tone of his pages shifted. The railway had become a rumor in itself. Supply trains were delayed or never arrived. The men began to ration not only food but also the use of light. Letters grew shorter not because the sentiment was diminished, but because men could no longer scrape together the paper and matches to write long testimonies. The rest was survival. In one letter dated December 3rd, he scribbled, between the lines of a request for his mother's recipe for marzipan. We dig in ruins and count the echoes of our boots. The city answers with firing and smoke. The baker's smile is far. He described the winter as if it were a living thing, a patient, impartial beast that had come to sleep over the city and would not budge. Temperatures fell. Frost crept into the seams of the coats and into the bones of men who had not yet learned how to grow new ones. The men learned to wrap their feet twice, to sleep in shifts beneath a single blanket, to trade stories that kept their voices alive for one another. Karl wrote about these small economies of survival, the sharing of tobacco, the barter of a nickel's worth of sugar for a sharing of memories. Sometimes he risked humor. He wrote of a lieutenant who collected spoons. A mania for spoons, Karl called it, with the resigned affection of a younger brother pointing out the quirks that keep a group human. These details mattered because they were proof of life. In one letter, he even sketched a small cartoon, a man with a huge spoon clinging to a loaf as if it were a lifebuoy. And yet beneath the chatter of spoons, there were lines that smelled of fear and the first seeds of doubt. In a letter dated December 18th, he wrote, almost in a parenthesis, we were told to hold every street. The orders are clear as frozen mud. A man says to me, how long until the whole thing falls silent? I laugh, but my laugh melts quickly. He had begun to see the logic of the campaign fray. Doctrine demanded territory, but territory demanded bodies, and the bodies were his comrades. By late December, the letters grew rarer and raggeder. The postal system that connected front to home faltered. Trucks blocked by wreckage, telegraph wires snapped. The last leg often performed by a man on foot with a satchel and an oath. Karl described receiving a bundle of mail smelling of home, and how the sight of Käthe's handwriting made his hands tremble. He tucked a small scrap of that same bundle, a page torn from a children's book, into the hem of his tunic. Months later, the scrap would be the only thing that preserved a flush of childhood in a world grown adult and gray. He wrote from the ruins of a building once grand, now only facades and bone. He described the job of picking through the rubble not to retrieve weapons, but to find things that made life bearable. A tin of condensed milk, A child's wool cap, a fragment of a ceramic mug with a painted robin on it. They were not spoils of war. They were relics of ordinary days. In one poignant passage he wrote, "We found a letter in Russian under a stove. It might have belonged to a mother. We passed it around. We could not read it, so we imagined it to be a recipe. It warmed the men. The letters, too, began to contain fragments of witness." Karl recorded the names of comrades who vanished between one page and the next, sometimes as if he were keeping a ledger. Hans, frostbite on foot. Otto, fevered on watch. Lehman, last night's mortar. Names became the human measure of attrition. He wrote to Käthe with a bluntness that sometimes surprised him. "If I die, remember the bread." It read like a joke in the margins, but he meant it. Memory, he knew, needed anchors that were both humble and absolute. On New Year's Eve, the sky over Stalingrad was not festive, but mechanical, each burst of flame answering another in the grid of ruined streets like a clock that measured anguish. Men made a ritual of passing around a small bottle of schnapps, offering toasts to absent fathers, to mothers, to pastry ovens back in Würzburg that now seemed mythic. Karl wrote a note and folded it into his pocket. For Käthe, should the bottle find her. That bottle would not make the journey home, but the act of writing it down was a keepsake in itself. The last undamaged letter he managed to mail, or perhaps pass to a courier and hope it reached its place, carried a change, in tone that readers later would call the winter letter. It was dated January 10th, 1943, and on it his handwriting was, for the first time, shaky not because of frost, but because the pen had to be held with a deliberate intent. He wrote of hunger, yes, of men scraping at frozen porridge. He wrote of the unending shelling and the way that even the ruins seemed to breathe smoke. He wrote of a lieutenant who carried a rosary he had found in a collapsed church, and who said evening prayers not for God, but for the last loaf. And then, with a clarity that cut through the descriptive passages, he wrote this line: "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always. Love was the thing I could not unlearn." He added a practical request, as if domestic life were a reality that possibly outlived the war. "Tell Mother to keep the oven warm in case I return. If I do not, let someone else take the bread. Feed the neighbor's boy." The humble, human bureaucracies of love and charity flowed through the violence like a stubborn stream. That January letter is the first that researchers later pointed to as a kind of testament, not a manifesto, not a confession, but a last small articulation of what a life had been before it was weathered. Its paragraphing betrays a man trying to order his thoughts into priorities: words of love, small instructions, witness, and a joke shoved near the end. "Do not laugh at my terrible crossword results," he wrote, an attempt to reclaim the ordinary even on a page likely to be the last that would reach home. When the letter left Stalingrad for the last time, who carried it is not known with certainty. Some accounts say a clerk at the field post accepted it and promised to forward it. Others say a comrade, entrusted with the package of mail, stuffed it inside his shirt as he skulked behind a ruined facade to avoid the shelling. The point is less the route than the ritual, that in a city convulsed by violence, men continued to make the fragile offering of words bound in paper, trusting them to cross barbed lines and frozen rivers. Back in Würzburg, Käthe kept the letters in a small chest beside the stove. She read them aloud to her mother and then folded them back into the familiar crease, as if by repetition she could press its ink deeper into memory. In late January, when word in the town turned toward rumor that certain units of the Sixth Army had been encircled, that the mail had stopped in whole tranches, she still waited. She cupped the last page she had, the winter letter, against her cheek, feeling the roughness of the paper and the ghost of his handwriting. The pages smelled faintly of coal smoke and something alive, the trace of a man who had tried to keep his humanity by naming little things. Historian accounts later would call the winter letter emblematic, not simply because of its sentiment, but because it compresses the ordinary into the extraordinary. A baker's son in a ruined city teaching us, through a few lines of ink, what it is to try to make life endure. The letter becomes a witness in itself, one that preserves the shape of small mercies in a winter that tried to erase them. December 1942 turned to January 1943, and Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of echoes. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with soot, and every breath felt borrowed. The men called it the bowl. The Soviet armies had closed around them from north and south, sealing the Sixth Army inside a cauldron of frozen ruins and broken streets. The Kessel, the pocket, a word that sounded harmless, even domestic, until you realized it meant being cooked alive in ice. Karl Hoffmann wrote fewer letters now, but each one carried the density of a prayer. On January 12th, he wrote in his tattered notebook, "We are surrounded. They tell us relief will come from the west. They also told us the winter would be short." His pencil strokes were faint. The graphite barely caught on the frozen paper. His handwriting leaned forward as though trying to move faster than despair. Outside, the horizon burned every night, red and black, a furnace without warmth. Soviet artillery pounded the perimeter ceaselessly. Buildings collapsed inward like lungs exhaling for the last time. The soldiers moved among them silently, shadows carrying rifles, faces hidden behind frost-bitten scarves. They were too tired to curse, too hungry to hope. Karl's platoon, once 40 men, was now 14. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Weber, had stopped giving rousing speeches. His orders were short and flat, the way a doctor might speak to a patient he can no longer save. Hold the line until morning. Morning always came, and so did the shelling. Postal service had broken down entirely. The last functioning field post had been overrun weeks earlier, but the men kept writing anyway. They wrote on scraps of packaging, on the backs of captured Soviet propaganda leaflets, even on pieces of their own uniforms. They addressed them to mothers, wives, children, anyone who might remember them as something other than soldiers. Karl's second-to-last letter was found years later in the pocket of another soldier's overcoat. It began, "Käthe, we are told the Führer has not forgotten us, that we will be relieved. But even the ice knows better. The snow does not believe in promises." He tried to describe the cold, how it made their fingers wooden, how coffee froze before it reached their lips, how the dead froze standing because the ground was too hard to bury them. He joked, a soft, broken kind of humor, that the cold was democratic. It didn't care if you were an officer or a private. It humbled everyone the same, but the deeper truth hid between his lines. He wrote that men had started speaking less and staring more. That silence had become a new form of communication. That sometimes, in the moments between bombardments, they would sit together and listen to the sound of the Volga cracking in the distance, a sound like glass splitting under the weight of ghosts. The chaplain of the regiment, Father Metz, continued holding evening services in the cellar of a ruined apartment block. There was no altar, only a splintered door propped on ammunition crates, a single candle guttering in the cold draft. Karl went once, curious. He wasn't devout, not in the way his mother was, but he missed the sound of words that weren't orders. The priest read from a small Bible, his voice hoarse from smoke and cold. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." When he finished, a soldier laughed quietly. Not in mockery, but in disbelief. Mercy seemed like a foreign word now. Later, Karl would write to Käthe, "The only mercy left is that the shells fall faster now. The waiting is worse than the dying." That letter, historians later noted, captured the fatalism that spread through the Sixth Army like frost through a window pane. Invisible, unstoppable, beautiful in its own terrible way. By mid-January, each man received 75 grams of bread per day, about the size of a matchbox. It was made of flour, sawdust, and sometimes straw. Soup was a luxury. Melted snow with a handful of barley, or if they were lucky, horse meat. Karl's notes became more like fragments of a diary than letters. "We boil belts for soup. Some eat candle wax. One man traded his wedding ring for a tin of sardines. I think of our bakery, of crusts I once threw to dogs. What a feast that would be now." He began sketching again. Small drawings in the margins of ruined walls. Bread, ovens, his street in Würzburg. It was his way of remembering warmth. The men teased him for it, but not unkindly. They called him Der Bäcker, the baker. He embraced it, a shred of identity that still belonged to him. When others traded their watches or medals for food, Karl kept one thing, a flour scoop he'd used at home. He said it reminded him that hands could make things other than death. On January 24th, a broadcast came through the frozen radios. The voice of Field Marshal Paulus, the 6th Army commander, still insisting that they would hold out. Every soldier of Stalingrad is fighting bravely. The Führer's trust is with you. The men listened in silence. Some laughed bitterly. Others simply turned away. After it ended, Lieutenant Weber said, "The Führer's trust won't fill a stomach." No one disagreed. That night Karl wrote in his notebook, "Not as a soldier, but as a witness. They tell us we are heroes. But heroes do not starve. Heroes do not eat snow." He folded the page and tucked it into the lining of his coat. It would be found there months later, when the thaw came. By the last week of January, the city had turned into a single, continuous wound. Artillery fire was constant, and corpses lay stacked behind walls to block wind. The Soviets advanced street by street, flamethrowers clearing cellars that once held life. Karl's company was ordered to hold a section of tractor factory that was already little more than twisted steel. They fought for hours, days perhaps. Time had become circular. At night, in the rare quiet, Karl still wrote. His pencil was blunt, his sentences shorter. It is cold beyond imagination. But there are moments still. A song, a fire, a kindness. "I am no hero, Käthe. Only a man who wishes to see another dawn." That line would later appear engraved on a memorial to the unknown soldiers of Stalingrad, discovered in 1998 by Russian historians. They never found Karl's body, but they found the words. January 30th, 1943. The day began with an eerie stillness. Snow fell soundlessly onto ruins that no longer looked like buildings. No one spoke much. The radios were silent. Then the news spread like a slow whisper. Field Marshal Paulus had surrendered. Some men cheered weakly. Others cried. A few simply sat down and closed their eyes. For Karl, the word surrender did not sound like defeat. It sounded like relief. That evening, as Soviet troops moved cautiously into the ruins, he wrote one last note. Not even a letter, just a few words on the back of a torn map. The firing has stopped. The silence is heavier than the shells. If these words survive me, tell Käthe I fought for warmth. He tucked it into his breast pocket with the rest of his letters. When his body was found months later, that scrap was still there, frozen to his chest. Historians believe Karl Hoffmann died sometime around February 2nd, 1943, the day the 6th Army officially ceased to exist. But his letters survived, carried by comrades, recovered from corpses, preserved by the very cold that killed them. Through them, we can still hear the faint pulse of humanity inside the machine of war. A baker's apprentice who believed, until his last breath, that love was something you could bake into bread, even in a city of ashes. February 1943. For the first time in months, the guns of Stalingrad fell silent. The wind moved through the ruins like a sigh, sweeping across the collapsed buildings, across frozen bodies half buried in snow. The city no longer had a heartbeat, only memory. When the Red Army's 64th Division marched into what remained of the German sector, they found nothing resembling an army. Only men wrapped in blankets and rags, too weak to stand, their eyes glazed and hollow. Some still held weapons without bullets. Others clutched photographs or rosaries or folded letters. Among them were the letters of Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, stuffed into a small pouch inside his tunic. The pouch was stiff with frost, the paper inside fragile as dried leaves. One soldier, Private Sergei Volkov, would later write in his diary, "They carried words as if words could keep them warm." After the surrender, the Soviets began the grim work of counting, not bodies, but silence. Tens of thousands of German soldiers became prisoners. Tens of thousands more never would be counted. The dead lay in frozen rows that blurred ranks and uniforms. Karl was never officially identified, but his letters were. A Soviet translator named Anna Petrovna found them while cataloging personal effects at a field collection point near the Red October factory ruins. She was 24, a former schoolteacher from Leningrad, who had volunteered to help with the records. The letters were in German, but written with unusual tenderness. Anna, who had lost her husband in 1941, found herself reading them aloud softly as she translated. Each page was dated carefully, the handwriting growing weaker with each passing week. She noted the phrases that struck her. Love was the thing I could not unlearn. The snow does not believe in promises. In her notebook, she wrote beside them in Russian, "This man was not our enemy. He was everyone's son." While the ruins of Stalingrad froze into a graveyard, 1,900 kilometers away in Würzburg, Käthe Hoffmann still waited. Every day she visited the small post office on Domstrasse, even after they told her there would be no more mail from the Eastern Front. She refused to believe it. The women in line whispered that the Russians had captured everyone, that the men were gone, that Stalingrad was a word best not spoken. But Käthe kept a ritual. Morning bread baked for one, an extra plate set on the table, a single candle lit near the radio. She read and reread Karl's last letter, the winter letter, until the edges tore. She traced the words with her finger, whispering them like prayers. Her neighbors pitied her but also envied her. She at least had words, while their men had vanished without a trace. In March 1943, the town received the official notice. Missing in action. Presumed dead. Stalingrad. Käthe folded it carefully and placed it beside the letters. She refused to call him dead. Not yet. In Stalingrad, Anna Petrovna couldn't forget the letters. She kept them hidden under her coat for days, then weeks, afraid they'd be burned as enemy material. But one night, after hearing a fellow translator read aloud a captured German diary full of hatred and propaganda, she decided Karl's words were different. They weren't about conquest. They were about longing, memory, and small mercies. She copied the letters by hand, one after another, into her notebook. Then she made a decision that would shape both of their fates. When she was reassigned to a prisoner camp processing unit in Tambov, she took the originals with her. Months later, through a neutral intermediary with the Red Cross, she sent a small envelope to Germany. Inside it were three things: the winter letter, in Karl's original handwriting, her translation in Russian, a note that read, "He wrote this for someone who waited. Please return it home." The envelope bore no return address. It took 6 months to cross the chaos of post-war Europe. In August 1943, Käthe received the parcel. The handwriting on the outer label was unfamiliar, but inside, the letters, the words she knew by heart. Her hands trembled. For the first time, she saw the last note Karl had written, the one found in his pocket. "The firing has stopped. The silence is heavier than the shells. If these words survive me, tell Käthe I fought for warmth." She sat on the floor of her kitchen, weeping not with shock but with a strange peace. He had not vanished without a trace. He had spoken to her across time and death, and she had heard him. Later, she took the Russian translation, though she could not read Cyrillic, and pinned it beside his photograph. For the rest of her life, she would never remove it. When neighbors asked, she said, "Someone on the other side of the world carried his words back to me." That's all that matters. For Anna Petrovna, the war ended, but the memories did not. She returned to Leningrad in 1945, resumed teaching, and married again. But in her personal diary, discovered after her death in 1971, she wrote about Karl Hoffmann's letters often. She called him the German who wrote like a poet. "His words taught me," she wrote, "that mercy survives language. The same frost that killed him preserved his heart." She never knew if the letters reached their destination, but she hoped they had. In 1999, a historian named Dr. Werner Schreiber was cataloging civilian correspondence at the Würzburg Historical Archive when he came across a small bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. They were the Hoffmann letters. still wrapped in the same twine Käthe had used. She had died in 1985, and her estate had been quietly donated to the city archive. Inside the bundle, Schreiber found a note in her handwriting. They found their way home. So did he. Dr. Schreiber published an article titled, "Letters from Stalingrad, A Voice from the Frozen Front." It was modest, just a few pages in a historical journal, but it became the seed for a later documentary that spread the story beyond Germany. Audiences were stunned not by the horror of war, which they already knew, but by the humanity in the words of a single soldier who never stopped, writing about love and bread and small kindnesses. For historians, Stalingrad represented the turning point of the war. For Karl and Käthe, it was a love story cut off by winter. But beyond that, the letters taught something deeper: the endurance of ordinary emotion in extraordinary suffering. A Soviet soldier once said, "The battle ended, but the silence never did." Karl's letters fill that silence, not with triumph or ideology, but with warmth. They remind us that history is made not only by generals and battles, but by the small, stubborn insistence of people who refuse to stop being human. When the documentary aired in 2005, one of the surviving prisoners of Stalingrad, a man named Otto Rehm, who had served in the same regiment as Karl, watched it on an old television in Munich. He recognized the handwriting on the screen and said quietly, "He wrote that letter beside me. I told him it would never reach home." He paused, smiling faintly. "Shows what I knew." In that moment, decades after the last gunfire faded over the Volga, Karl Hoffmann's voice, carried by frost, war, and kindness, finally reached every home that ever waited for a letter that never came. February 1943. Stalingrad. The surrender had been signed, but no one really knew what that meant. The guns were silent, the sky gray and low. A deathly stillness blanketed the city. But silence, as the survivors soon discovered, was not peace. It was only the beginning of another ordeal. The Soviet soldiers moved carefully among the ruins, rounding up the survivors. The men of the Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, were now skeletal figures wrapped in rags and frost. They came out of basements and cellars like ghosts, their hands raised, eyes hollow. Many had long since discarded their rifles, or used them as crutches to limp toward captivity. One Red Army officer watching the scene later wrote, "They looked less like soldiers than shadows wearing uniforms." The prisoners were ordered to assemble in columns and begin marching east. The destination was unknown. Some said a camp in Tambov, others whispered about Siberia. All that was certain was that it would be far, cold, and merciless. Among the men who started that march were several of Karl Hoffmann's comrades. His body had not been found, but his words had. Inside a small leather pouch recovered from a fallen man, someone had found Karl's final note. "If these words survive me, tell Käthe I fought for warmth." They passed it from hand to hand as the march began. No one spoke much, but each man looked at the paper as though it were a relic. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a reminder that one of them had remembered what it meant to be human. The road out of Stalingrad was lined with frozen wreckage, tanks half buried in snow, horses stiff as statues, burned trucks, and the occasional marker where someone had fallen. The wind never stopped. The men's breath came out in small clouds that vanished almost instantly. They marched through nights so cold that eyelids froze shut. The weaker ones fell behind and were never seen again. No one had the strength to look back. A survivor later recalled, "We did not bury the dead. We carried the living, and even that was a miracle." The rations were almost non-existent. A few crumbs of bread, a handful of frozen cabbage soup if they were lucky. Men ate snow to wet their throats. They tore pages from notebooks and chewed them for moisture. At night, they huddled together in burned-out barns, whispering to keep their sanity. It was during one of those nights that Feldwebel Otto Rehm, one of Karl's old squadmates, pulled out the letter again. He read it aloud softly, voice cracking in the dark. "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always. Love was the thing I could not unlearn. The men fell silent. For a moment it felt as though Karl was with them, not as a ghost, but as warmth. One of them said, "He still fights for us." They folded the letter again and tucked it inside their shared pack. As they moved farther east, Karl's letter became something sacred. Whenever a man fell sick or despaired, the others would bring out the page and read a few lines. They began calling it Der Brief des Bäckers, the baker's letter. One of the men, a mechanic named Heinrich Voss, copied the words onto a strip of cloth torn from his undershirt so they wouldn't lose them if the original was taken away. He wrote in tiny block letters, pressing the pencil with trembling hands. He later recalled, after the war, "It wasn't religion that kept us alive. It was the idea that one man, before he died, still believed in love." The Soviets guarding the column sometimes watched in confusion. One officer, seeing the men whispering over the letter, asked through an interpreter what it was. When they told him, the officer only nodded. He didn't take it away. He, too, had lost friends. By late February, they reached the Volga. The river was frozen solid, a vast white desert under a pale blue sky. The wind screamed across its surface, carrying fine ice that cut their faces like sand. Crossing it was like walking across the edge of the world. Each step echoed in the silence, each breath a small act of rebellion against death. Men collapsed mid-stride, and the living stepped around them. There was no cruelty in it, only exhaustion. At the midpoint, Otto Rehm paused, pulling the letter from his coat. He held it up to the horizon, where the sun was a dull red circle through the haze. "Look, Karl," he said softly. "We're still walking." Then he tucked it back and kept moving. Later, when a Soviet guard noticed the gesture, he didn't stop him. He saluted instead. Even enemies, in that moment, recognized something sacred passing between them. The prisoners eventually reached a makeshift transit camp, a place of mud and barbed wire. It wasn't a camp so much as a holding ground for the half-living. Typhus spread like fire. Frostbite claimed hands and feet. Out of every 10 who had begun the march, barely 4 arrived. The rest had frozen or fallen along the way, nameless and unmarked. Inside the camp, men continued to whisper Karl's words. They wrote them on the walls with bits of charcoal, carved them into wooden boards, even murmured them in their sleep. For them, the letter was proof that someone among them had remembered how to write not as a soldier, but as a man. One day, a nurse named Irina Mikhailovna entered the camp. She was barely 20, with frost-reddened cheeks and weary eyes. Her duty was to tend to the sick Germans, not out of sympathy, but necessity. She noticed a small scrap of paper tucked beneath a sleeping man's arm. When she unfolded it, she saw Karl's handwriting. Faint, delicate, barely legible. She couldn't read German, but she recognized the word Liebe repeated several times. Love. She copied the letters into her notebook and drew a small heart beside them. Later she said, "It was the first time I'd seen love written by the enemy." That night she boiled water for tea and secretly gave it to the prisoners who could still drink. They thanked her with weak smiles. One of them whispered, "For Karl." She didn't know who Karl was, but she nodded anyway. Weeks passed. The prisoners built crude shelters from timber and rags. Spring began to creep across the frozen landscape, quietly, hesitantly. Otto Rehm, now gaunt but still alive, kept Karl's letter folded in his pocket. He read it less now, not because he had forgotten, but because he no longer needed to. The words had become part of him. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in months, he said to a fellow prisoner, "When I get home, I'll tell them about the baker who taught us to keep warm without fire." And he did. When Otto was released years later in 1949, he returned to Germany with nothing but the clothes on his back, and that letter. He would keep it until his death in 1980. The paper was yellowed, torn, and fragile, but still legible. The march from Stalingrad remains one of history's bleakest journeys, a trail of endurance, hunger, and loss. But within it, the story of Karl Hoffmann's letter became something else, a quiet act of defiance against oblivion. The men who carried it survived longer than those who did not. Not because the letter fed them, but because it gave them meaning, a reason to take one more step. And that, historians later wrote, was what made the difference between dying in the snow and walking out of it. Even after the last camp was closed, after the last survivor returned home, fragments of the letter appeared in strange places, inscribed on memorials, quoted in diaries, murmured in interviews. One phrase endured: "I fought for warmth." In a world gone cold, that sentence became a spark, the human fire that refuses to die even when the body does. For years after the fall of Stalingrad, Germany lived in a strange twilight between denial and grief. The families of the missing wrote to the government, to the army, even to the Red Cross, but the answers were always the same: no record found. It was as if the men who had marched into the East had simply dissolved into the snow. By 1945, the war had ended. Cities lay in rubble, flags changed, and people spoke in hushed tones about the millions who would never come home. But somewhere deep in the Soviet Union, in the camps at Tambov, Beketovka, and Suzdal, small groups of surviving prisoners still lived, barely living, but alive. One of them was Feldwebel Otto Rehm, the man who had carried Karl Hoffmann's letter through the march, across the Volga, and into captivity. He had survived 6 winters and 6 summers in a camp of sickness and hunger. He never expected release, and when it finally came in December 1949, he could hardly believe it. They were loaded into rail cars, not as prisoners now, but as remnants. The train clattered westward through snow and empty fields. Each mile was a ghost's mile, every station a reminder of how far they had come from the men they once were. When Otto crossed into Germany, he said it felt like walking through a memory that no longer belonged to him. The towns had changed, the faces were new, the language the same but thinner, worn out by years of defeat. He carried with him one small thing: the folded, yellowed paper he had kept since 1943, Karl's letter. It was no longer a relic of war to him, but a compass of humanity. He decided that if he survived to see Würzburg again, he would find Käthe Hoffmann and return it to her with his own hand. Würzburg had been nearly destroyed by Allied bombing in 1945, the beautiful Baroque city reduced to ashes and stone. By 1950, reconstruction was underway, but the scars were visible everywhere: burned cathedrals, shattered bridges, families living in half-collapsed homes, and among the survivors many widows still waited for husbands, brothers, sons, long after hope had faded. Käthe Hoffmann was one of them. She had aged beyond her years. Her hair had turned silver early, and her hands were thin, the skin pale from years of rationing and factory work. She still lived in the same small apartment above what had once been the family bakery, now just an empty shell. On her mantelpiece sat a photograph of Karl in uniform, beside a vase of wilted flowers. When Otto arrived at her door, she didn't recognize him at first. He was gaunt, stooped, his face weathered by time and loss. But when he said the words, "Stalingrad, Karl Hoffmann," she froze. He removed his cap and held out the folded paper. "This belonged to your husband," he said. "He kept writing, even when the world stopped." Käthe's hands trembled as she took the letter. It was worn soft at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. She traced her finger along the familiar script, tears spilling silently. For a moment neither spoke. Then Otto said softly, "He kept us alive, all of us." That night, Käthe lit a small candle on the table and read the letter aloud. Her voice broke, but she read every word. The jokes about the snow, the quiet love, the promise to fight for warmth. When she finished, she looked up at Otto. "Did he suffer?" she asked. Otto hesitated. Not out of fear, but because he wanted to choose words that would not wound her. "He suffered," he said. "But he never stopped believing in home. And he never stopped writing." He told her how Karl's letter had passed through hands and hearts, how it had been read on the frozen Volga, whispered in the camps, and carried for years like a relic of the living. He told her about the nurse who had given them water in secret, and the guard who had saluted instead of punishing them. When he finished, Käthe reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Then he came home," she said simply. Otto nodded. "Yes, in every way that mattered." In the years that followed, Käthe lived quietly. She never remarried. She worked in a small bakery rebuilt from the ruins, using the same oven her husband had once tended before the war. Every morning she baked bread and placed one loaf aside, always warm, always untouched. When asked about it, she said it was for someone who never stopped being hungry. Locals knew the story by then, of the soldier who wrote letters from the frozen front, of the man whose words had crossed borders and years to return home. They began calling the shop Das Brot des Briefes, the bread of the letter. Otto visited her every winter, on the anniversary of the surrender. They would sit by the fire, share tea, and read Karl's letter together. Always the same words, always the same silence afterward. He once said, "He baked hope into words." She smiled. "And you carried them." In 1968, a historian from the University of Munich contacted Käthe after hearing about the letter. She hesitated to part with it, but eventually agreed to let it be copied for an archive exhibit titled Voices from Stalingrad. When she handed the letter to the curator, she said, "Promise me you'll read it as if it were written today." The curator nodded, later admitting that he cried while holding it. Not for the soldier, but for the ordinary love trapped in extraordinary times. The exhibit toured across Germany, then Europe, and eventually Russia. In Leningrad, an elderly woman attended the showing. Anna Petrovna, the translator who had first rescued the letters. When she saw Karl's handwriting behind the glass, she pressed her hand against it and whispered, "You made it home." In 1979, Otto made his final visit to Würzburg. He was 70 now, frail but still sharp-eyed. Käthe was older, her voice softer but steady. They sat together once more at the same wooden table where she had first read the letter decades earlier. As the candle burned low, Otto said, "You know, sometimes I still hear him." Käthe smiled faintly. "He was always the louder one." They both laughed quietly. Then Otto added, "I think he'd be happy." The world finally listened. When he died the following year, Käthe sent a small note to the historian who had preserved the letter. He carried the fire for him. Now they both rest. When Käthe passed away in 1985, the city of Würzburg held a small memorial in her honor. On her table, beside the vase and photograph, was Karl's final letter, still folded neatly. She had written a short note and left it with the papers. Let it stay where it began, in a home warmed by love. Today, the letter is preserved at the German Historical Museum in Berlin under low light, displayed behind glass with a small caption, "Letters from Stalingrad, Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, 1919–1943. I fought for warmth." Visitors often pause there longer than at the larger exhibits. Some cry, some simply stand in silence, as if listening for a voice that once crossed a continent of death just to say, "I remember you." History remembers the Battle of Stalingrad as one of strategy, loss, and numbers. But through Karl Hoffmann's letters, it becomes something else, intimate, human, and unbearably alive. His journey did not end in the snow. It ended in the quiet kitchen of Würzburg, where a wife read his last words and felt his warmth again. And that, perhaps, is the real victory. That love, handwritten in the ruins of war, outlived the empire that sent him there. Berlin, 1998. Half a century had passed since the last letter from Stalingrad was written, and Germany was a different place. Reunified, modern, filled with noise and motion. Yet in one quiet archive room beneath the Museum of German History, the air still smelled of paper and dust, of things the world had chosen to forget. Dr. Werner Schreiber, a soft-spoken historian in his 40s, spent his days cataloging wartime correspondence, diaries, telegrams, field notes. He wasn't searching for heroes or villains. He was searching for voices, voices that had been silenced, misquoted, or erased. It was on a gray January afternoon, as snow fell against the museum windows, that he found the box. Label, Private Collection, Würzburg Estate, 1986. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all neatly tied with a faded red ribbon. On top lay a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. In ink, faint but legible, were the words, "They found their way home. So did he." Dr. Schreiber opened the bundle carefully and read the first line that would change his life. "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always. Love was the thing I could not unlearn." He froze. There was something profoundly human about the handwriting. Not propaganda, not military record, but a heartbeat preserved in paper. For days, Schreiber couldn't stop reading. He skipped lunch, stayed late after closing hours, his glasses fogging as he bent over each fragile page. The handwriting told a story of its own. Neat at first, then trembling, finally desperate. Each page a pulse of life, fading into snow. He cross-referenced the letters with army rosters and casualty lists from the 6th Army. Eventually, he found him. Gefreiter Karl Hoffmann, 305th Infantry Division, 576th Regiment. Missing Stalingrad. February 1943. The name was ordinary, one of thousands, but the words were not. Unlike most letters of the time, which spoke of duty and Führer and sacrifice, Karl's letters were different. They spoke of love, hunger, and warmth, of a man clinging to his humanity in a world bent on erasing it. Schreiber realized he wasn't just holding personal correspondence. He was holding a moral artifact, something that transcended borders, language, and ideology. He decided to trace the story back. A week later, Dr. Schreiber traveled to Würzburg, the same city where Karl and Käthe Hoffmann had lived before the war. The old bakery still stood on a narrow street, rebuilt after the bombings. Above its door was a small sign, faded but legible. "Das Brot des Briefes," the bread of the letter. Inside, the air smelled of yeast and warmth. The woman at the counter, now in her 60s, recognized the name immediately. "Käthe Hoffmann? Everyone here knows that story," she said. "She baked a loaf every morning for a husband who never came home. When people asked why, she said, 'Because someone has to remember that he was warm once.'" She led him upstairs to a small apartment that had been turned into a memorial space after Käthe's death. On the wall hung a single frame. Karl's last letter, written in pencil on yellowing paper. Underneath it was a plaque. He wrote of warmth in a world of ice. Schreiber stood there for a long time, reading the words aloud under his breath. He could almost hear the scratch of pencil on paper, the wind outside the ruins, the ghost of a voice saying, "If these words survive me." Through his research, Schreiber learned that not all of Karl's letters had survived. Some had been intercepted, others lost during the Soviet advance. But rumors persisted, of fragments kept in Russian archives, in private collections, or forgotten in state vaults marked "Enemy Correspondence." So in the spring of 1999, he wrote to the Russian State Military Archive in Moscow, requesting access to prisoner documents and confiscated personal effects from the Battle of Stalingrad. He expected bureaucracy and silence. What he received, months later, was a simple envelope postmarked Moscow. Inside were photocopies of 6 additional letters, in Karl's handwriting, and attached was a note from the Russian archivist. These were translated by Anna Petrovna, 1943, preserved by her daughter. The circle had closed. Schreiber traveled to Moscow that winter to meet Anna's daughter, Irina Volkova, then in her late 50s. They met in a small apartment near Tverskaya Street, walls lined with books and old photographs. Irina served him tea in a chipped porcelain cup and placed her mother's diary on the table. "This," she said softly, "is how my mother remembered him." The German who wrote like a poet. The diary's first entry about Karl was dated February 1943. He wrote of bread and warmth. "My husband died at the front, but this stranger's words reminded me of mercy." Irina handed him one of her mother's sketches, a pencil drawing of a man sitting amid ruins, writing by candlelight. On the back, in Russian, was written, He could have been anyone's husband. Schreiber realized then that this was not just a German story or a Russian one. It was a human one, a fragile bridge built across the wreckage of war by two people who never met, yet understood each other perfectly. In 2001, Dr. Schreiber organized an exhibit at the Museum of German History titled Letters from Stalingrad, The Voice of One Soldier. It displayed Karl's original letters, Anna's translations, and a photograph of Käthe's bakery. The exhibit drew thousands: veterans, widows, students, even children too young to know what the word Stalingrad once meant. People stood in silence before the glass cases. Many cried openly. One old man removed his hat and whispered, "He wrote what we all felt but never said." A reporter from Der Spiegel wrote, "Hoffmann's letters remind us that history is not written by victors, but by survivors, even when they do not survive." Soon, Russian museums requested copies of the letters. In 2003, the exhibition traveled to Volgograd, the modern name for Stalingrad, and opened inside the old tractor factory museum, not far from where Karl had written his final note. At the opening ceremony, Irina Volkova read aloud in Russian, "If these words survive me, tell Käthe I fought for warmth." When she finished, an elderly Russian veteran saluted. No one applauded. They simply stood in silence. In his journal, Dr. Schreiber wrote, "I came here to study war. I ended up studying love." What Hoffmann left behind was not a record of battle, but of endurance, the insistence that even amid ruin, a man can remain human. He donated his research notes to the museum and kept one photograph of Karl and Käthe together, smiling before the war. He framed it in his office beside his own wedding photo. Whenever students asked why he studied Stalingrad, he would gesture toward the picture and say, "Because someone once wrote that love was the thing he could not unlearn." By the early 2000s, Letters from Stalingrad had become a published collection, translated into 8 languages. Readers around the world found echoes of themselves in Karl's voice. His small jokes, his longing, his quiet strength. Schoolchildren in both Germany and Russia wrote essays about the baker of Stalingrad. Artists painted murals. Musicians composed songs. And every winter, a loaf of bread is still baked in Würzburg in his honor. Simple, unsweetened, wrapped in brown paper. A note beside it reads, "For those who fought for warmth." Dr. Schreiber died in 2017. At his funeral, a colleague read the closing lines from Karl's letter. "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always." And as the wind brushed through the cemetery trees, it was said that for a moment you could almost feel the warmth that had survived the coldest place on Earth. By the early 21st century, Stalingrad had long since become a name from textbooks, a chapter in history too large for the imagination to contain. But Karl Hoffmann's letters refused to fade. They had escaped destruction, crossed enemy lines, and survived 2 dictatorships and 50 winters. Now they lived again, in classrooms, museums, and hearts. They were no longer the story of one man's suffering, but of everyone's shared humanity. In 2005, a modest paperback titled Letters from Stalingrad, The Baker's Last Words, became an unexpected bestseller in Germany. It wasn't a political book. It wasn't written for historians. It was written for people. Those who'd never held a weapon, but knew what it meant to love, to wait, and to hope against reason. One reviewer wrote, "These letters remind us that the front line is not only made of trenches and ruins, but of the fragile hearts beating inside them." In a high school in Munich, a history teacher named Lena Kruger began reading Hoffmann's letters aloud to her students every winter. She called it the lesson of warmth. Each year, as snow fell outside the classroom windows, her students would sit in silence while she read, "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always. Love was the thing I could not unlearn." The words hung in the air, heavier than any textbook. Some students cried, others stayed quiet, writing reflections afterward. One boy, 16 years old, wrote in his notebook, "I used to think war was about maps and borders. Now I know it's about people. I don't want to be brave like soldiers. I want to be brave like Karl, to keep kindness alive. Lena kept that note pinned to her desk for years. In 2008, the Letters from Stalingrad exhibition toured again, this time traveling between Germany and Russia as a joint memorial of reconciliation. At the opening ceremony in Volgograd, an elderly Russian veteran named Nikolai Dmitriev stood beside a German visitor, Martin Hoffmann, Karl's grandnephew. They shook hands before the crowd. Then Nikolai spoke. "Your uncle's letters reached my city long before you did. His words showed us that even our enemies bled, prayed, and loved." Martin, holding back tears, replied simply, "Then they found their home." That photograph, of a Russian and a German clasping hands beneath the display case containing Karl's final letter, made international headlines. It was printed in newspapers under the caption, "The war ends again." Back in Würzburg, a local priest began a quiet tradition. Every January, on the anniversary of the surrender of Stalingrad, the Church of St. Kilian held a candlelight vigil. The congregation read excerpts from Hoffmann's letters, not as scripture, but as testimony. Children carried loaves of bread to the altar, wrapped in brown paper, just as Käthe once did. An inscription on the church wall read, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And blessed are those who remember, no flags, no uniforms, just silence and candlelight, the kind of silence that heals." In 2013, a German filmmaker named Johannes Berg released a documentary titled Letters from Stalingrad, The Voice of the Baker. It opened with an actor reading Karl's words over black and white footage of the ruined city. "We dig in ruins and count the echoes of our boots. The city answers with firing and smoke." The baker's smile is far. The film was minimalist. No orchestral score, no reenactments, just narration, still photos, and the sound of pencil scratching on paper. But audiences were overwhelmed. Veterans wept in theaters. Younger viewers wrote online, "I never knew a letter could make war feel real." The film won international awards, but its director said something more meaningful in an interview. "This isn't a film about a soldier. It's a film about humanity surviving its own madness." Afterward, a museum in Volgograd began showing the film on loop in a small room where the walls were covered with images of snow, ruins, and the faint shape of a hand writing a letter. In 2017, the German-Russian Memorial Fund established an online archive called the Archive of Warmth, dedicated entirely to letters, diaries, and messages written by ordinary people during wartime. At its heart was Karl Hoffmann's collection, scanned, translated, and freely accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Messages poured in from across the world. Descendants of soldiers, teachers, refugees, and even modern soldiers serving in peacekeeping missions. One message from a Syrian student read, "Your words are like a hand reaching out of history to tell us, do not forget to love." That line was later engraved on the website's main page. Dr. Schreiber's assistant, who had inherited his notes, said during the launch, "When we preserve a letter, we preserve a heartbeat." And so Karl's heartbeat continued, across languages, across generations, across screens glowing softly in the dark. In 2020, 80 years after the battle began, a young woman named Elena Hoffmann, Karl's great-grandniece, visited the Stalingrad Memorial in Volgograd. She carried a small envelope in her hand, sealed with red wax. Inside was a copy of the original winter letter. Standing in the bitter wind beside the eternal flame, she read it aloud in German, her voice trembling. "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always." Russian school children, visiting on a field trip, stopped to listen. When she finished, one little boy asked in broken German, "Was he a hero?" Elena smiled gently. "No," she said. "He was human. That's harder." She placed the envelope at the base of the memorial, and the wind carried a few flakes of snow across it, just as it once had across the ruins where he wrote. In 2023, 80 years after the surrender, the German and Russian presidents jointly unveiled a plaque at Volgograd dedicated to civilian compassion during the war. Inscribed at its base were Karl's words in both languages. Love was the thing I could not unlearn. The plaque stood not near the military statues, but in the small memorial garden behind the museum, quiet, unguarded, surrounded by flowers. Visitors often leave small pieces of bread there. Some write new letters, fold them, and slip them between the stones. Messages to strangers, to loved ones, or to history itself. A Russian child's note left there last winter read, "I hope your wife got your letter. We got it too." Karl Hoffmann died in the snow at Stalingrad, but his words outlived the war, the nation, and even the century. He had no medals, no monuments, and no descendants. Yet he became a symbol of the one thing history rarely preserves: empathy. His legacy isn't written in victory or loss, but in ink and silence. In every letter that says, "I love you," in every message sent across distance, in every act of remembering, Karl still lives. For in the end, history is not only about who fought, but about who felt. And somewhere between the ruins of Stalingrad and the quiet kitchens of Würzburg, that feeling endures. Soft, warm, human. There are letters that die the moment they are sent. And then there are letters that never stop traveling. Karl Hoffmann's words belong to the second kind. Always in motion, always finding new hands, new hearts. 80 years after the snow buried his body, and the noise of war went silent, his voice still moves, through museums, classrooms, kitchens, and screens. It is no longer just a soldier's farewell. It is a human reminder that even in the darkest places, someone was still writing about light. Historians say that every war has its witness, but not all witnesses carry rifles. Some carry pencils. Karl's witness was simple. He didn't record battles, strategies, or orders. He recorded hunger, laughter, the sound of boots in the snow, and the smell of bread he could no longer bake. He wrote because it was the only way left to stay alive. Not in body, but in soul. And somehow, against all odds, his words lived long enough to find their way to us. Volgograd, 2025. Inside the small memorial gallery built on the site of the Red October factory, a new exhibit quietly opens. Its title, The Last Letter. Visitors enter a narrow, dimly lit corridor. On the walls are projections of snow falling slowly over black and white photographs. Soldiers in trenches, burned buildings, frozen streets. A soft voice begins to speak in German. "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always. Love was the thing I could not unlearn." The voice is not Karl's, of course. No recording of him exists. It is a reconstruction made by historians and voice artists using letters, testimonies, and regional dialects. But the effect is haunting. People stop walking. Some close their eyes. A Russian visitor whispers to her daughter, "Listen. This is what the enemy sounded like when he loved." The curator of the exhibit, Dr. Irina Volkova, granddaughter of Anna Petrovna, the translator, stands in the corner, watching. For her, the story has come full circle. Her grandmother had once hidden these same letters in her coat, risking punishment to preserve them. Now, generations later, they are displayed under soft light, protected by glass. After the last visitor leaves, Irina often stays behind. She switches off the overhead lights but leaves the projection running. In the silence, she whispers to the empty room, "You made it, Karl. You finally came home." On her desk lies a small notebook, her own translation of the letters into modern Russian. Next to it, a single line written in her grandmother's handwriting. "Mercy survives language." That same winter, a copy of Letters from Stalingrad is translated into Japanese, then French, then Arabic. Each edition carries the same image on the cover, a pair of hands holding an envelope against a field of snow. In every country it reaches, readers send letters of their own. One woman from Kyoto writes to the museum, "Your soldier taught me that love can survive even when the body cannot." A student in Egypt writes, "He fought for warmth. I fight for kindness. We are not so different." By the time the collection's 100th anniversary approaches, the museum receives thousands of such letters each year, addressed not to the curators, but to Karl himself. They are stacked in boxes marked, "To Stalingrad, for the baker." In 2028, a restoration team working in a former POW archive in Tambov, Russia, uncovers a forgotten envelope inside a rusted locker. The paper inside is nearly destroyed, the ink faded. But under magnification, faint words emerge. The last letter Karl ever wrote. It isn't long, just 8 lines. It was likely never delivered, but its words are clear enough to read. "The night is cold, but not cruel. I still see the bakery, the flower on the windows, and your hands when you waved goodbye. If this reaches you, know that I was not afraid. I thought of you every hour. Tell them I was still warm when I remembered." The fragment is authenticated, framed, and placed beside the others in the museum, the final missing piece of his voice. When it's unveiled, hundreds attend the ceremony. No speeches, just the reading of those 8 lines. And as the final words echo in the hall, even the guards at the door stand still. Years later, in 2035, school children study letters from Stalingrad in virtual history classes. Holographic recreations of the ruined city play behind the teacher's desk. But instead of focusing on dates and battles, the lesson begins with a simple question. What does it mean to stay human when the world forgets how? The students listen to the digital voice of Karl Hoffmann, reading his winter letter. When it ends, their screens fade to black, leaving only the words, "Love was the thing I could not unlearn." One boy raises his hand. "Did he win?" he asks. The teacher smiles softly. "In a way," she says, "he won the only war that matters." Back in Würzburg, the rebuilt bakery on Domstrasse still stands. Every morning, the baker places a single loaf in the front window, unpriced, uncut, never sold. A small sign beside it reads, "For the one who fought for warmth." Tourists take photographs, locals nod respectfully, but few speak inside. It feels more like a chapel than a shop, and on cold winter mornings the smell of bread drifts through the air, the same scent that once followed Karl from oven to battlefield. A scent of home. Käthe's name is engraved on a small plaque inside the bakery wall. Below it, another line in soft script. He returned through words. I met him in silence. At the end of the exhibit in Volgograd, there is a writing desk, a replica of Karl's field table complete with old paper and fountain pens. Visitors are invited to write their own letters to anyone they've lost, or anyone they still love. Some write to fathers, mothers, or lovers. Some write to history itself. Every month, the museum collects the pages and places them in a steel box beneath the floor. They call it the Eternal Letter, a new time capsule of human emotion buried in the soil of a city once burned to ash. A museum attendant once said, "If war begins again, perhaps these letters will remind us not to finish it." In the end, what remains of Karl Hoffmann is not his rank or his cause or his nation. It is his handwriting, uneven, fading, human, a trace of warmth pressed into paper in a place that had forgotten what warmth was. His final words, now engraved in both German and Russian on twin memorial stones, read, "Tell them I was still warm when I remembered." And maybe that is the truest thing war can ever teach. That to remember, even in ruin, is to resist oblivion. That love, even in its smallest form, outlives the empires that forget it. So if you ever find yourself standing in snow, in silence, with the wind against your face, listen closely. You may still hear a voice carried by time, whispering, "If the letters do not reach you, know that I thought of you always." And in that whisper, soft, distant but enduring, Karl Hoffmann still lives, not as a soldier, but as the last warm heart of a frozen city.